Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would briefly discuss a meta-analysis that I just came across because it appeared in social media feeds by both Dr. Brad Schoenfeld and Coach Paul Carter today. Now, a lot of us would say, do we really need a meta-analysis on this? We have so much scientific data on this between epidemiology, between metabolic ward studies in a controlled environment. We know that carbohydrates aren't particularly fattening, and we know that they aren't really that big of a contributor to the obesity epidemic. Perhaps refined sugars are. They seem to be a factor, but they still fit into overall caloric intake, and we know that dietary fat usually contributes the most to body fat gain when compared to even the most refined carbohydrates, even though they compare. But a meta-analysis was done. And that's the thing. It's like the frustrating thing whenever people discuss studies like this, you will always have the scientifically illiterate chime in. And what I mean is we can have a meta-analysis like this, and what will people who follow the ketogenic stuff say? Because usually people who follow ketogenic diets are usually fairly scientifically illiterate as far as stuff goes, and that's because the science doesn't particularly support it. But they will say, well, you know what, I can find a study that shows anything. And again, this displays the big problem. The fact that we have people who want to discuss studies who don't understand the difference between a meta-analysis and a scientific study. And here's a perfect example. Someone who says that, the counter response would be like, yeah, but if all you have is 5 studies and I have a meta-analysis, I win. In other words, a meta-analysis, if all you can come up with is 5 studies to counter a meta-analysis, and that meta-analysis addresses your studies, you have to go with the findings of the meta-analysis. If you're going to be scientifically literate and you're going to actually look at the evidence, because the job of a meta-analysis is to look at every study done in an area. A meta-analysis doesn't look at one study, it looks at 20 studies, 50 studies, 60 studies, and it compares the weight of evidence in every study and attempts to explain discrepancies. Meaning, if you have 10 studies and 3 of them show that table sugar causes body fat gain, even without a calorie surplus, and 7 of them show it doesn't, and 5 of the 7 actually show some fat loss in the right environment when large amounts of table sugar are consumed, and I'm just throwing that out there, a meta-analysis has to actually explain why you got 3 different sets of results. It actually has to look at the weight of the evidence and figure out why there's a problem. It has to do multivariate analysis and figure out what variables got missed, what got messed up in these studies, because you can't have studies that study something similar that get 3 different results without explaining the results. They need to be understood, and you have to look at the variables and how they were controlled and all these other factors to say, okay, here's the problem. This is why we have different findings. This is the exact reason in this study when we look at the variables that caused this study to give a different result. That's what meta-analysis does. It goes through and looks at the total sum of the information and says, okay, we need to get to the bottom of this based upon all the studies we have in the area, and let's figure out what they have in common, what they get right, what they get wrong, look at the weight of the evidence. We need to come to some sort of consensus based upon the sum of the studies. So obviously, if you come up with a study that's different from the meta-analysis, you probably need to go look at the details of the meta-analysis and make sure that they didn't address your study, because they might have looked at it already and shown the problem with it. And a lot of people would say, well, why do we need this? We know carbohydrates don't really store as body fat in humans. Yeah, we know that, but there's a big market for fad diets that doesn't seem to know that. You've got this whole insulin hypothesis out there, which has been largely discredited. That, high circulating insulin levels cause body fat gain even in the absence of a caloric surplus, or that low circulating insulin levels don't allow for fat to be stored. All this other nonsense, stuff that we know is not true. But, you had to have this meta-analysis. And what does it basically say? It says we can't find a finding that shows any real correlation between high carbohydrate intake and body fat gain. And obesity doesn't really seem to go hand in hand in the absence of a calorie surplus. There's a lot of factors involved. There's a lot of factors involved in obesity having to do with genetics, environment, fat intake, appetite, all these factors, but high carbohydrate intake doesn't seem to be one of them. From what we can tell, there's no evidence at this time. And a lot of people will look at a meta-analysis who, again, don't understand, and they'll say something like, oh, well, the meta-analysis just can't find the evidence. When a meta-analysis says that it can't find evidence of something, that means there isn't any evidence. Doesn't mean that it's not true, but it's pretty unlikely. Because the meta-analysis is there just to look and see if the evidence exists. And if it can't find the evidence, then that means there is no real evidence. There's no credible evidence when you look and compare all the data. And that's what people need to remember. When you start looking at stuff in the metabolic ward, what do we know? We know that higher carb diets cause less fat gain than higher fat diets do with the same calories. All right, so that's a take-home message right there. If you eat a calorie surplus, you gain some fat, right? That's a given. But if you eat a higher fat diet, you'll gain more fat than you will on a higher carb, low fat diet. What's our real culprit here? Our culprit here is the combination of dietary fat and caloric surplus. In fact, we've had studies where short-term, extremely high caloric surpluses can be maintained when dietary fat is kept very low that don't cause body fat gain. At least in a short period of time. It takes a little while for it to even kick in. So we've got plenty of studies showing that. What do we know on epidemiology? Cultures that eat the most fat have the most body fat. Cultures that eat the highest percentage of their calories from carbohydrates usually have the lowest obesity rates. See where we're going here? This is a problem with this whole insulin hypothesis. And this is large sums of data. I mean, again, epidemiology, and we don't always use epidemiology for everything, but I mean, that's pretty damning right there towards the whole insulin hypothesis. When we look at different cultures, and the more carbs a society eats as a percentage, the leaner they are, and the more fat they eat, the fatter they are. You know? And that matches perfectly with what we see in the metabolic ward, that usually people on higher carb diets usually end up with slightly better body composition than higher fat diets. I'm not saying they don't lose more weight. Sometimes the lower carb, higher fat diet might lose more weight, but they lose more muscle. They lose more muscle. In many cases, the diets might be similar fat loss, but if you're losing more muscle, your metabolism goes down more in the long term. Well, that's what happens when carbs go too low on the higher fat diets. You know that in plenty of studies. They're terrible for preserving muscle. They're terrible for gaining muscle. They're terrible for athletic performance. Higher carbohydrate and higher protein diets simply preserve muscle tissue and metabolism better. So again, we're getting back to these points, and we start looking at all these studies. This idea that there's something fattening about carbohydrates outside of their caloric value isn't based on reality. And if we have to pin down a macronutrient and say, well, this macronutrient on a calorie for calorie basis is most fattening, it's always fat. By a small margin, protein being the least, carbs somewhere in between. It's just not supported by the science. And I mean, at least we have a meta-analysis looking at that now, because normally it's really hard to argue with a lot of these people because you produce 20 studies, they produce 3 studies and think that they've beaten you. So at least if anyone understands what a meta-analysis is, you can point this in their direction. They can look at it and be like, oh yeah, maybe you're right, since we've got a meta-analysis showing that high carbohydrate intake doesn't seem to cause obesity, at least in the absence of caloric surplus. And, you know, most carbohydrates, barring the heavily refined ones, can be relatively satiating. At the end of the day, we know that it's low activity level, hyperpalatable foods, you know, which can be a combination of refined sugars combined with fats and everything else. That's usually your most hyperpalatable foods are the ones where we start combining refined sugar with fat together. You want to talk about foods people are going to overeat, there you go. There's your recipe. But they'll do it also with enough dietary fat even without the sugar present. There's a lot of factors there. We just know at this point, the sum total of the evidence is saying there doesn't seem to be a link with high carbohydrate intake and obesity. And again, basically the take home of this. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.